Well, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for hanging in there with us for this very important panel. So I am going to just briefly give you a sense of who we have on the panel, and then we're going to dive right in. So we have next to me Alexandra Cousteau, an ocean advocate and environmental activist. Bertrand Walckenaer, the Deputy CEO of the French Development Agency. Mekka Brunel, the CEO of Gecina. And Felicity Aston, a polar explorer, which is, by the way, the best title ever. I feel somehow I should have that title in my life at some point. So before we start the conversation with our really phenomenal panel, I want to start by just framing the conversation for us a little bit. Globally, two of the biggest challenges we face today are gender equality and addressing climate change and ensuring we have a sustainable future. We want to make clear in this conversation that women are more than victims of climate change, although certainly that is the case, that, for example, 80% of climate refugees are women. But as this panel will demonstrate, women are key to developing climate solutions that can really move us forward towards both gender equality and a climate sustainable future. So as Sophie mentioned, at the G20, alongside the G20 meeting earlier this year, the Women's Forum adopted a G20 Charter for Action with some really important goals around achieving gender equality and climate decision-making, really using data in a very real way, opening up opportunities for young women to go into STEM fields, and a number of other actions. And there's one really important quote that I wanted to start us with here because I think it goes to where this conversation is so important. And the quote is, "Radical collaboration between business, NGOs, universities, governments, communities, and individuals that acknowledges the interdependence between climate change and women's empowerment presents us with an opportunity to shape the future." And that's what we're here to talk about today, shaping the future. I'd say just, again, three quick other things. We're all in this together: business, government, the non-governmental sector, and all of us. We obviously have 11 years to act, and we know that those 11 years are ticking away. We also know that women's leadership is critical. When women are in parliaments, in higher numbers in countries, environmental treaties tend to be enacted much more quickly and efficiently, and there aren't enough women in parliaments around the world today. It's only 24%. So that's one thing we need to think about. And we also know that women are adapters. When women see change is needed in the climate area, they take action. And so with that, I'm really going to start the panel off. And I'm going to open with one question to all four of our panelists, which is, I think, a really fundamental question. And from each of your perspectives, I'd like you to talk about the link between climate change and women's empowerment. How do you see that linkage? Because often people, as I started with, see women as victims and think of these as two non-connected topics. So, Alexandra, if I could just start with you and move down the row, that would be great.
Thank you, Stephenie. So I come to this with a generational perspective. My grandfather, Jacques Cousteau, was the first to bring the underwater world to audiences around the world and help them fall in love with 70% of our planet that had really been unexplored and unknown up until that time. And he was an explorer. So he explored the oceans, and my father picked up that baton, but took it further and started articulating a conservation ethic for the oceans. The idea that we should protect what we have while we have it. Today, having grown up in that environment and spent my entire life in the ocean arena, I realize that we've lost 50% of our oceans, of the blue natural capital, the abundance and productivity of our oceans. And so I started wondering why. How is it that we've come to this place today? And I think that one of the key insights that I have is that the words that we use to describe and define our work and our aspirations aren't ambitious enough. The words conservation and sustainability are really about maintaining a status quo. And if you've lost 50% of something, it's not good enough. We have to raise the bar. And so I think it's time that we start talking about rebuilding, regenerating, restoring the abundance of our oceans in order to be able to actually create the solutions pathway to get there. Part of the problem, and the reason I'm mentioning this, is that when you talk about conservation, you're setting up a zero-sum game. If you want to cut down the forest and I want to protect it, one of us is going to win and one of us is going to lose. And we know that that doesn't work. And yet it is a paradigm that exists and persists in a post-colonial patriarchal world. What I've noticed as I've traveled around the world working with different communities, and specifically women, is that women optimize collaboration. And women are key drivers for rebuilding their communities on whatever issue it is. In my experience, it's oceans, but it can be many other issues as well. And so what we're looking at doing to address climate change, and I think women have an important role to play, both in driving the conversation and how we articulate our objectives and our ambitions and how bold we are in what we want to bring back to this world and gift to our children and to future generations. So articulating that message and driving that message forward and driving that message as a way to shift paradigms, really important. But my experience has also taught me that women are often unrecognized and unrewarded for their work in fisheries, in seaweed aquaculture, even though they are bringing money to their family and food to the table. So we're looking at how we can catalyze carbon sequestration in the oceans. The oceans are the biggest carbon sink, and we want to be able to help catalyze that through ocean afforestation and expanding forests in our oceans, which are currently shrinking because they have 5 times the ecosystem services of a rainforest. And women have a critical role to play in making that successful.
Well, great, and we'll come back. I want to talk to you more about the women in fisheries and how we utilize the power of those women in the work that you do, but also the work that's so important to all of us. So, Bertrand, the floor is yours on the link.
Thank you very much, Stephenie. I have 5 postcards at home that I brought back from Cameroon, where I lived for a year. I bought them in the suburbs of Douala, and I have been having them on my wall in one of the corridors of the place where I live for maybe 10 years. I joined the AFD 8 months ago, so it's a new job for me. And it's also the first time I've been talking about gender initiatives and about what we do to promote male and female equality with the team of the French Development Agency. And the link between those 2 stories is that on those 5 postcards, I have 5 different persons, very typical of African craft and art that you can find in those countries. One individual is cutting wood, the other one is crushing maize, the third one is harvesting a crop in a field, the fourth one is plowing a field, and I do not remember about the 5th one. But what I've come to realize is that those 5 individuals are women. And this is something I had not realized when I bought the postcards 10 years ago. This is something I have not realized over the last 10 years, but this is something I've realized a month or 2 months ago after I've been working on female and male equality. So from this very interesting thing, from a very personal perspective, I take 2 lessons. The first one is that I think we should all have those 5 postcards at home, and it's a very useful tool to engage in a conversation with friends and ask them at a dinner, friends and families, if they notice something specific on those postcards. And the remarks, and very, very rarely will they be able to notice that the 5 individuals on those postcards are females. Very, very interesting. The second, and it's also, there's also a link between that and the fact that being the only man in this panel is also a good way to change perception and to see the world a bit differently. And the second thing I take from that is that as the French Development Agency and as a development agency, we work in countries where women are in the field, where they do very hard chores, where they plow the fields, where they harvest the grain, they carry water over very long distances, and they go after wood as well to cook at home over very long distances. And the link here between climate change and women activity is very significant, because when there is less rain, when desert is closer to their home, they have to go much further to go after water. They have to go much further to go after wood. It means that they can have bad meetings along the way. It happens more often in countries where women have to walk 10 kilometers as compared to countries where they only have to walk 1 kilometer, obviously. They also spend much more of their time looking after water and wood, and that time is not dedicated to other things such as creating business. And the other thing is that when those women need their girls to do the job with them, those girls are not at school, they are not educated, and they are not in a position afterwards to get a job. And it's also true with extreme climate weather events. If you think about women who have a crop that is wiped out by a flood or by a hurricane, that person will lose everything, which means that the next year she will have no money to send her children to school. She'll have to take them back to the field, and she'll have to work with them, and they will not be educated, and they will never get an opportunity to get to school, to be educated, and to run a business afterwards. So there's a very straight and direct connections in the countries, in the 85 countries where we work, on climate change, which is going to be more and more problematic, and the impact on daily lives of women.
Well, and I think as someone who used to work in the US government and focused a lot on how we think about women in all the various development and diplomacy activities, I want to come back to you on really what you're doing in terms of your development assistance in a very granular way. But I am fascinated always by sort of all the work that gets done on the ground and how important it is to really think about those individuals and the impact on them. Mekka, you come from the private sector, and so your perspectives on the linkage between women and climate change.
Thank you. Can I take just 1 minute to say how impressed and honored I am to be here years after year, and I would like to congratulate Women's Forum, especially Chiara Corazza, for what she's doing to make this subject more and more important, and she deserves all applause. So on the topic you are mentioning, I think that we are talking about half of the humanity. And you mentioned a lot of questions raised by the way women are put aside on the top of not being considered and all the rest. And what we have done in our sector, we are in the real estate sector. We are very French. We are very Parisian, by the way, in terms of the quality of our assets where they are located. But ultimately, we decided we are in a business where 60% of our colleagues are female. And at some point, less than a decade ago, there was such a big, difference of salary between women and men in our organization. And the board, which is a completely balanced board, half women, half men, decided to go and get the equality of salary done and promote women in our organization, give them a chance to develop their skills, to be more and more confident in their capacity to deploy their energy and their skills and their talent. And 6 years after, we are 40% of our executive committee is female, including in top executive, in top positions, and not only support, positions. We are doing a lot on sustainability, and we are very profitable. And we are very dedicated because we consider that real estate is, with transport, one of the most, polluting, industry in the world. And we have the obligation, we must do what is needed at our level to decrease the impact of carbon, to get, much more efficient building in terms of energy, in terms of carbon, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of quality of life. And for doing so, we need to have all the talents together around the table. Consider that half of the humanity has a lot to say about what we have to do as a global, community, as a worldwide community. When we are talking about, climate change, we all by the sudden consider and find out that the Earth is not but one country. We are talking globally. We are not talking about such and such, nationality, language, I don't know, religion, whatever. We are talking about our common house. And talking about our common house, we cannot put half of the humanity aside talking about that. And each of us have the impact. All the drops that are going to become a rain and create all these rivers are necessary to do what we have to do and to be efficient in what we have to deliver. And this is what we try modestly, but at our level, to do in our buildings. And energy efficiency, low carbon, wellness, and biodiversity are the 4 pillars of our environmental policy in our company, and everybody is really working on that side. Now, what I have to say though, running a company with 40% of women, having a board 50% of women, I must say, is less quiet compared to what it used to be when it was fully, male organizations, but I love that.
Good. Well, I take a little noise anytime, so. Felicity.
Well, when I present myself as a polar explorer, the thing that I'm told most often is that I must be unique, that I am a rare thing, being a polar explorer and being a woman. And that's just not true. I know lots of amazing women who are polar explorers and have made wonderful expeditions and who have been scientists in the polar regions that have made wonderful discoveries. It's just that the perception is that we're not there. In the polar regions, for example, the common belief is that women are pretty new arrivals to the polar regions. Well, my little hobby is collecting stories of women who have been to the polar regions, and the earliest one I found goes back to 1774, which is interesting because Captain Cook was the first person to cross the Antarctic Circle in 1773. So a year later, we've got the first story of a woman arriving. She was French, and she happened to be a courtesan, which was a bit of a shame, but she was there. And the point is that I think with the story of climate change and the story of science, we're seeing a similar thing. I first went to Antarctica as a scientist in the year 2000. And when I went there, I was in the minority as a woman and a scientist. But I certainly wasn't the first. There have been women in the field for a good 20 years before that who had done fantastic work. And now, today, the situation, I'm happy to say, is a lot different. If you go to an Antarctic station now or a polar research station, you're likely to find as many women working there as men. So that's all great. But I think with the climate story, as Méka was saying earlier, it really underlines how diversity is essential if we're going to progress as a society. And the climate story, the issues and the consequences that we're facing surrounding changing climate and a changing planet really underlined that we've all got to be involved. And so I think from a gender equality point of view, this brings about 2 things. The first is it's an opportunity to really shout about women's contribution, that it has been there and their roles have been really vital, and to be more vocal about that so that those women are more visible. Because if we don't have role models, then we won't have people following those pioneering paths, and that's what we really need. So it's an opportunity to be more vocal, but it's also an opportunity to underline the gaps. So in the scientific world, for example, there are a lot of female scientists working in the field, but then you get to a certain managerial level, and those women tend to disappear. And I think it's a similar story in a lot of industries. So it underlines the roles that women are playing and have played, but it also underlines the gaps and the gaps that we need to fill. And I think those are 2 really important conversations and focuses that we need to have when we talk about climate.
Well, I want to keep going with a couple more questions for each of the panelists, hopefully at least one. But I want to, since you're talking, Felicity, I'm going to go with you. We talked a little bit backstage about this issue of being a role model in a positive way. I don't mean to make it sound like a bad thing, both in terms of, a role model for others about what a polar explorer looks like, but also how people listen to you in a different way when you say you're a polar explorer, and they're more willing maybe to take in certain information about the erosion of the ice caps and what you see on the ground. So could you talk a little bit more about that and how you use your role and the kind of interest people have, fascination with what you do to really push forward on educating people about climate change?
Yeah, well, I went to Antarctica as a climate scientist in 2000, so 20 years ago almost now. And back then it was the case that if you wanted to say anything definitive about climate or trends, that meant you had to go back to exactly the same place and make exactly the same measurements for decades at least before you could confidently say anything about anything changing or any kind of trends. Now that's not the case. In 20 short years, you can measure trends and changes because they're happening so fast. You can measure them a lot faster. But even though that was the case, when I was working in climate science, people were less willing to hear what I had to say than when I had my Polar Explorer hat on. They were much more eager to ask me about climate and changes and things associated with climate when I was a Polar Explorer. And this is a trend I saw more broadly in that it always fascinated me why people paid more attention to a Hollywood celebrity that had spent 5 minutes on the Greenland ice sheet and wanted to know what they thought about climate and what the truth was. And that was the thing. They would put more store by what they said than some poor scientist who'd spent the last 3 decades of their life going back to the Greenland ice sheet every year to make very detailed, collect very detailed data. And somehow that was less trustworthy than the word of someone with a very different type of credibility. And I always found that very fascinating. And in recent years, I found that maybe that trend is shifting. And what has come to our aid is fake news. Now that we're in the era of fake news, people are a lot more discerning about where they're getting their information from. They're a lot more savvy about what gives someone the credibility to be an authority. And they're much more likely to question themselves, why am I listening to this person rather than that person? And I think this is helping in the climate fight in terms of communication, because people are much more willing now to talk to someone who has credibility that can be checked and verified than someone who perhaps doesn't have that same level of authority. And this is also, I think, working in the favour in terms of gender equality, because now that, well, years ago, when I first started leading expeditions, perhaps as one of very few, if not the only woman in a polar team, I found that I would have to sort of lay out my stall early days about my credibility. I'd have to be very upfront and forceful about, this is why I'm here, this is my credibility, this is my authority. Whereas now I'm finding that that is less so. But before, it was because I was a woman, I found I had to do that more than my male peers. Now I'm finding that kind of everybody has to do that. You have to say where your authority comes from and show that that is genuine, that you're not a faker. So I think that means that I'm less likely to be judged on the fact of my gender. I'm more likely to be judged on my credibility, because people are more likely to be asking everybody, why are you here? What is your authority? Yeah. So fake news, bizarrely, I think is working in our favour, both in terms of climate and in terms of gender equality, because people are much more discerning now.
I'm going to take that back and hold on to it about the fake news. Mekka, you have talked a lot about, I appreciate talking about in your specific sector, the work that you've done at your company, which is amazing in terms of really moving the needle on gender equality and ensuring that the projects and the buildings that you build are sustainable and more climate friendly. But I know you've also talked about mega trends, and sort of as you're looking at the future, the role of climate change as a megatrend and how you see that kind of affecting the debate and where you see us going with that in the future.
Yeah, in our sector, we believe that there are 3 megatrends which overcome all the rest of geopolitical issues or interest rates moving up and down all the time. I'm used to say when I started to work, interest rates were at 15%. Today they are at minus something, and I don't know how to handle that. And there is no, business school where you learn how to deal with negative, interest rate. So this changes all the time. But these 3 megatrends, which are global, and it impacts, of course, our business, but many other businesses. One is urbanization and metropolization, the fact that people are moving to city center around the hub of public transportation in mixed-use areas. Whether we agree on that or not, by 2030 or 50, depending who is putting forward the numbers, this is going to be the trend. And so why people are moving to the city centers? One of the reason is the migration because of the climate change and the transformation of this climate change and the impact globally. And the second reason is that they are looking for more services, more capacity, more capacity also to find a job, to live in the community, actually. So that's why, by the way, we see a lot of desertification of our countryside, actually, everywhere in the world. The second trend is about the revolution, the technological revolution, which is bringing a new way of life, much more centered on individuals, but also innovation and the fact that we would like to be much more flexible, do whatever we want, whenever we want. We shop, we work, we launch, whatever, whenever we consider that is the right time. By the way, it's very complicated in large cities to organize that, but this is going to have an impact. And the third one is the climate change, because you're right, by the way, the world has changed, and I'm not sure that today, unfortunately, we can reverse the global trend in terms of climate change. At least we need to learn how to live with this new temperature going up. The Paris, agreement was talking about +2 degrees. I think that we are above that. At least I don't see what we can do globally today to go otherwise. So I think that what we have to do is how we are going to transform and impact and reverse the design of our buildings to cope with and to deal with these new climate, changes and organization and the impact, the social impact of that, which is going to be tremendous. We already see that with the number of migrants. Some of them, most of them, are because they are going through draft in their home countries. They are living in areas that they have nothing to eat or to live with, etc. And these are the trends we are facing. And we need, as a company, as a corporate, to do whatever we can at our level, modestly, but to prevent that and to find solutions globally for our society. One thing we talk about ESG, environment, social governance. But I think that the 3 letters are talking about sustainability. Whatever we are doing must be sustainable. And we need to be coherent and do whatever we have to do on a long-term basis and make it work. And if we do that and we are consistent and coherent and we are doing that on a long-term, on a sustainable way, then we have a credibility whether we are male or female, and we can also sustain and to have our say in the environment in which we live, which is very complex. But there is a lot of also sources of hopes and imagining a better future because of all the innovation which are possible today. We are not only thinking of our IRR and the financial way of looking at our investment, but what is the contribution, how does that impact, how it's going to transform, etc. And probably women empowerment has helped to have another view on that. I'm pleased to see that today in our business.
Very good, thank you. Bertrand, we've been talking a lot about these issues at the level of conversations we all have, but you obviously are in an agency that provides development assistance on the ground. And people on the ground in countries across Africa and other parts of the world are obviously very affected by climate change. People in rural areas who don't have as much access to capital or as much access to land and water, as you've said. So can you talk a little bit about how you all at the French Development Agency think about kind of getting down in the weeds, really, no pun intended, and working with women particularly, but in general, on how to address climate change?
Development agencies provide grants and loans. The grants are provided thanks to the money that is for the French Development Agency, provided by the French Ministry for Foreign Affairs on the basis of the taxes that we all pay and that goes to the national budget. And as far as the loans are concerned, we are a bank and we provide loans like any other bank would do. And our challenge today is to make sure that we can finance and that we have an impact on gender through our loans, through the loans that we provide. And why is that so? It's because if we consider the amount of projects that would be financed this year by the French Development Agency, it will reach an amount of approximately 14 billion euros. And in those 14 billion euros, 13 are provided through loans, and 1 billion of the activity that we finance is provided through grants. So obviously, grants are much more constrained because it's a public resource which is in competition with justice finance, with home interior affairs finance, and so on. So if we only focus on grants, we'll always have a very limited impact. And the reason why we are much more effective, or we have been much more effective through grants, is because it's very rare that in the countries where we work, that gender issues are on the top of the pile of the government agenda. They'll think about water, they'll think about electricity, but gender issues and female and male equality is quite hard, or it's not on the top of their priorities, and it's much easier. You have much more leverage as a bank, as a development bank, to finance gender projects if you give the money. The problem, as I said earlier, is that if you can only use money that you give to those countries to finance gender projects, then you have a much smaller capacity to act and to promote female and male equality and to empower women. And there's also a beginning and an end to the project that we finance. And there's a high risk that between the end, after the end of the project, all what you've tried to achieve will disappear. So what we do today is we try to incorporate and we try to find any occasion to incorporate gender issues in the programs we finance through loans. I'll take a few examples to be more specific. There are the obvious thing you can do when you have a national legislation which discriminates between men and women. It's written that women cannot drive. It's written that in some countries, if a woman has been raped, she has to marry the man who raped her. These are things which are quite hard to address, but they are obvious because they are written somewhere. You can find them, and then what you have to do is harness as much support as you can between multilateral banks, with governments, with the civil society, and with very strong women and male leadership to have an impact on those legislation. And I was reminded prior to this meeting that it's been quite hard to incorporate gender issues in the negotiations of the COP21 Paris Agreement, but it was finally a success, and we hope that the COP25 discussions that will take place in Madrid by the beginning of December will remind us of the importance of being able to incorporate gender in international negotiations and international documentation. Then there's the issue of ground projects. We financed a few years ago, and we are continuing to do it, a subway in Kochi, in India. And at that time, when we first elaborated this project, we had no idea on how we could incorporate gender in that project. And then it turned out that in that city, all the drivers and all the staff of public transportation were in the very vast majority men. And so we had this idea to make sure that in the training facility and in the training components that we would include in the project to have people who would be capable of running the subway, and we would have drivers that would be women, that the staff will also be women. So we had that discussion with the local transportation authorities, and because there was a clear win-win game in making sure that women would be incorporated in the project, we now have approximately 75% of the staff that is linked to the maintenance and the exploitation of the subway, which are women. Another example is the partnership agreements that we've signed with the National Basketball Association and the FIFA, International Football Federation. Those people have an overwhelming power when it comes to marketing and leadership worldwide. And the reason why we've been very eager at working with them is because they will enable us to build basketball and soccer fields in the countries where we work, in the cities where we finance projects, and through their leadership and through the mobilization of those great players of basketball and football, we'll be able to have to take women from the vicinities and to have them on the field to play basketball, to play soccer, with a view of making it not something exceptional, but something very, very normal. And finally, a last grand example.
Okay.
When we finance school today, when we finance education programs in the countries where we work, we try to make sure that we'll have closed bathrooms in the school where we work. Because if you don't have closed bathrooms, there's a very high probability that women will not be able to go to school because they do not want to be harassed in the school. So they need closed bathroom to make sure that throughout the year they'll follow their education programs.
Thank you. And actually, research shows that girls being educated is the more education girls have, they're much more interested in getting involved in climate change activities, and also it really helps countries drive down climate emissions. So, Alexandra, I want to sort of end this part of the conversation with you. You said a couple of provocative things about our words aren't ambitious enough. And so I kind of like to have you talk about that, but also what you are seeing in terms of women on the ground, women in the fisheries, sort of how this really happens on a daily basis. Like, what do you see in terms of women's engagement, and how we should be looking to engage women more in this battle that we're engaged in right now?
Yes, well, again, through the lens of oceans. You know, the oceans cover 70% of our planet, and are the biggest carbon sink in the world. They feed the world, and yet they're diminishing, and they're continuing to diminish. And so it's become obvious to me that, especially with the oceans, which are able to regenerate so much faster than the land, where life can come back, fisheries can come back, abundance can come back if you, I think, have that as your goal, as your objective, and create a pathway to obtaining that. You know, right now we have 3 times as many fishing boats fishing in the oceans as the oceans can support. And so we're able to feed about 480 million people a day one protein meal. It ensures food security, it ensures livelihoods, it ensures many, many important things for countless communities. If we managed our fisheries for abundance rather than maximum sustainable yield, we could feed twice as many people and give them a food security that has a negligible carbon footprint, and is affordable, uses very little fresh water, and no land. So restoring abundance in the oceans is a critical strategy to address climate change on multiple different levels. And when you go further and look at ocean afforestation and the opportunities in seaweed aquaculture, as a food source, as a feedstock for biofuels, bioplastics, cosmetics, nutraceuticals, and a number of other industrial uses. Those forests, those new forests, could sequester an extraordinary amount of carbon, oxygenate the water, protect coastal communities and make them more resilient to weather events, and on and on and on. So I think that when I talk about the language that we use to represent our level of ambition, I believe strongly that the words that we employ are not fit for the challenges that we are facing. And unless we're able to articulate our ambition in terms of regeneration, rebuilding, restoring, abundance, both in the oceans, of course, but also on land, then we will not be able to achieve many of the sustainable development goals that we are looking to achieve. And I think my last comment would be, again, going back to the generational perspective that I have. My children are 4 and 8. So by 2050, they'll be my age. And we've all heard the prediction that by 2050, there'll be more plastic than fish in the ocean. That is one outcome. It could happen. The other outcome is that we could restore and rebuild and regenerate our oceans so that by 2050, science tells us it is possible they could be as abundant as when my grandfather first explored them 70 years ago. Those are two scientifically valid predictions, yet we only talk about one of them. So if we don't have a vision that's shared of an abundant future, how will we get there? It's not enough just to be against things, against plastic, against overfishing, against this, against that. We also have to be for something. We have to work together to articulate the vision of the future that we want to live in and that we want to leave to our children. And I think, in order to do that, we need to understand that every decision we make throughout our day should be with our children in mind. Right. Not our stakeholders, our shareholders, our customers, primarily for our children. And if we do that and we promise them an abundant future, I do believe that we can work to get there.
Great. I'm going to come back to you all in a minute on your call to action, but we have one front row intervention from Gwenaelle Avice from ENGIE. She's the Executive Vice President, works on renewables worldwide, and so she is going to give us just a few comments, and we only have literally 2 minutes left for this panel, so.
Well, an amazing discussion. That's incredible. And that reinforces my conviction that we have to act on climate change. I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer, I'm a business leader, and I've been into Greenland. Why is that? I wanted to testify on what's happening. And we have to accelerate, to take decision to act on climate change. And we can act as an individual. We can make the difference. We can change our habits. But we can also act as a company. We can take decision for good for the planet. And that's what we did with ENGIE, this company dedicated to the energy transition, because we want to develop green energy. So I'm not a polar explorer, I'm not an ocean explorer, but I'm a renewable explorer, meaning that I'm looking for more renewables for the planet. We need to develop means of production that are safe for the planet. That's basically our transformation that we've been through in the past 3 years. And to do that, we were thinking about our values. And what matters in terms of value is diversity. We will never make it happen if we don't have a diverse company. And especially the role of women is key. And I'm so proud to be working for a company with the only CEO of the CAC 40, which is a woman. It's Isabelle Cocher. And you cannot imagine how important we have a woman network within the company. And it is key to deliver our strategy on climate change. So my last word is, let's act on climate change. And to do that, let's act on diversity and empower women. Thank you.
Thank you. Which is a perfect segue to my final question to the panel. And I'm going to start with Alexandra and go down to Felicity. What is one call to action? One thing you want us all to take away, one thing that we could do?
Well, I'm actually going to pick up on what was just said. And, about 10 years ago, I was named as a National Geographic Explorer. And one of the conversations that we had at National Geographic was, what does exploration mean today? Because Google Maps has pretty much shown us every square meter of the planet. And I think what's become clear to me and many of my cohorts at National Geographic, is that exploration is no longer about Jacques Cousteau being the first to do something, or Sir Edmund Hillary being the first to do something, or French courtesan being the first to go to Greenland. But to be the first to see something in a new way, to be the first to have an idea or a solution or a perspective that can make a shift that we so desperately need, not so that we can continue to explore the geography of our planet, but so that we can start to protect the geography and the systems of our planet. And that means that each and every one of us can be an explorer. And so my call to action would be to please see yourself also as an explorer, and explore through your imagination, your creativity, your knowledge, your experience, your ideas, your vision, your hopes and your dreams. Explore what our options are to build a more abundant future for our children, because that is something that we can explore together, and it's vital that we do so.
Great, thank you. Bertrand.
I think that from our perspective, our goal is to identify in each and every of our projects if there are obstacles or cultural issues or legislative issues that will prevent women from either benefiting from our projects or from being given the same capabilities than men to do what they have to do, whatever it is, be it the fight against climate change or any other business activity that those women are having. So this is that very question that we are trying pushing very hard to incorporate in our day-to-day activity, and to make sure that our teams, and this is something we share on a worldwide basis with other donors and with other multilateral agencies. And I think the greatest next progress we can make is see whether we can embark the private sector and not just the public, be it national or international institutions, in such an action.
Great, thank you. Méka.
Well, I think the bar is set very high, but what we can continue to do, and we try to do within our organization, is to continue to ask why before taking any action, before just replicating the models we know from the past and which doesn't work anymore. And for doing so, we decided to put in place a sort of internal carbon fund to understand within our own organization, within each of our decisions, what is going to be the carbon impact. I mean, it's a sort of internal taxation. We are negotiating the rate actually internally with the team. But it's sort of educational way of understanding what is the impact of all the decisions we are making and whether it is worth to make these decisions or not, and to continue to foster that and to continue to make it work. Hopefully next year we can tell you that we either continue to be on the right direction, or we completely change the direction. But at least consider that we need to be much more integrated in terms of putting all the energies together, whether it is within our organization or from people coming from outside to helping us to think and to be innovative, and things get done.
And Felicity, the last word.
Oh dear. I want to bring it back actually to one of your opening statements, which is women can't be seen as victims of climate change. We have to be part of the solution. We have to be the innovators of solutions to the problem. And in order for us to be there at that table, we need women who are scientists, we need women who are engineers, we need women who are ministers, women who are presidents, we need women across the board. And in order for that to happen, we need role models. It's well documented that you have far more success if women that are coming up through the generations can see what they want to be. And that is a route to success. So that means we all have to work to make women more visible. The women who are already making such wonderful contributions, who are already fulfilling roles that perhaps traditionally you would not expect, we need to make them more visible and to make it clearer that women have always been there doing these wonderful things, but perhaps We need the value that society puts on that contribution to change a little. So whether you, or particularly if you are a woman in a leadership role or a woman who has the potential to be a role model, then you need to make yourself really visible. Or if you're around women that are pioneering, make sure they are as visible as you can possibly make them, because then we forge a path that others will follow, and hopefully we'll see more women around the table innovating and coming up with solutions.
Well, thank you. A perfect note to end on. I want to ask you to join me again in thanking our panelists who are amazing, and I just thank you so much.